guys, I am back and today I am going to be revisiting my initial review on the Dior Backstage eye palette in the shade Rosewood Neutrals. If you missed my first video on this palette, I will link it below in the description box and in the cards. But basically I got it as a gift over the summer. I did a first impressions and wear test on it, gave kind of my overall thoughts, and I was really excited about the palette. Now, my school has a 4-week-long break between two of our quarters, so I decided that since I needed to just pack like a very small makeup bag for going home, going out of town, all of those things, that I would pick a smaller palette, and I thought it would be a good idea to bring my Dior palette and see what I thought about it after 4 weeks of continuous use. So this is kind of a 1 month one palette, except it started kind of at the beginning of December and now it's ending kind of at the beginning of January. I did take some pictures of my looks that I've done with the palette. I don't know how easy they are to distinguish or like how really easy it is to see the colors. I do think that the colors in this palette are beautiful and has some really beautiful tones. And overall, I was happy with it. I would like to start by saying that. I feel like I have gotten to know this palette better than when I first did my impression on it. And I have kind of, I think, a better idea of what this palette has to offer, especially in the context of my collection. So I'm going to go through my thoughts and show you some looks that I did. I'm hoping to be able to layer them over one another. But essentially, this is what my palette is looking like now. So I have a big dip in the primer shade. All of the embossing kind of is sticking around on most of the shades, but I have a visible wear on almost all of them basically, except this one. And then, I mean, I can see where I've used this, but it's not like a big dip or anything. There's 5 mattes, a shimmer, a highlighter, and a metal are the kind of shadow formulas, and then this creamy primer. Normally I'm not a fan of creamy primers like this in palettes. I still think that I would have preferred to see another shade in this palette instead of the primer, but as far as travel goes, it was kind of just easy to reach for it when I reached for the palette. I think that that is something that someone might like about this palette, considering it's all in one, but it's not something that I think is a bonus when I look at this palette, but when I do use the palette, I tend to use it, especially when I am reaching for these darker shades and I want them to really pop. There's 2 shades in this palette that I consider like crease shades, the Rose Matte and the Wood Matte. So I tend to go in with the primer and then go in with one of those and decide, do I want it to be a pink look or more of a brown look? I really, really love this matte dark plum shade and this matte purple brown shade are both very good outer corner shades, liner shades. I think they're really beautiful. I did a look a couple times of like a purple smoky eye where I started with the matte dark plum and then blended it out with the matte wood and the matte purple brown shades, and I think it looked really beautiful. I also a couple of times went in with the matte rose and then did a liner look with this metallic burgundy shade, or the shimmer burgundy shade, and I thought that looked really stunning. I did one look that was very pink and it had the matte rose in the crease, and then I layered the dark plum shade on the outer corner and then had the metal, like the shimmery burgundy on like kind of the center of the lid, and then on the inner part of the lid I had the metal magenta, so it was this gradient of lightest to darkest, pinky to dark purple, and I thought that that looked really beautiful. And other than that, I would do just kind of simple looks where I put either the rose or the wood mattes all over the lid and in the crease, and then took a different darker shade to do a liner. Those tend to be easy looks to do when I don't have a ton of time. I think that the shimmer burgundy shade made a beautiful liner. I didn't even have to wet it. It was super pigmented and kind of a beautiful tone. I think I used the matte dark plum. I don't know if I ever used it as a wing liner, but I used it as a liner with just kind of hugging the lash line many times, and it is also stunning. As far as someone with brown eyes or someone who likes purple eyeshadows, I do think that this would be a good palette to invest in. The only shade that I would say I'm disappointed in is actually this highlighter shade. It's called a bronze. It's like a goldy champagne. It gets hard panned super easily, and it just doesn't pick up as well as like I want it to. It looks pretty, but on the eyes it just kind of like is like the littlest, teeniest, tiniest bit of shimmer. And since I had my Hourglass ambient lighting palette with me, if I wanted an inner corner highlight or something really sparkly for the lid, I tended to just reach for the highlight in that palette instead. Although I do really like these shadows, personally, I think that they are not for everybody. First of all, 3 of the shades that they mark as mattes have kind of a sheen to them. For example, this matte purple brown shade, I don't know if I consider this to be fully matte. As you can see, there's kind of a bit of a sheen to it, as opposed to this rose shade, which is matte and doesn't have reflect to it, but this brown shade kind of does have a little bit of a glow. If that bothers you, this palette is not for you. The other thing is I feel like the other thing is, again, this shade is just so disappointing. It's just, if it was like, oh, it's just like a little sparkly sheeny and you can just kind of like do it as a light wash, that I enjoy, but it doesn't even really do that. You can't layer it over anything. You basically have to go in with the primer and then this directly on top and like really pack it on to get any sort of like actual sparkle. I think if I did ever pan this palette, I wouldn't expect myself to pan this shade, or I would try using it as maybe a facial highlighter. It does have a beautiful glow to it, but it's just not something, I mean, I'm sure that there's a person who would use this eyeshadow and go, oh my god, it's stunning, and like it's a pretty color. Or maybe if I had a darker skin tone and the lightness of the shade contrasted more, then I might like it, but that shade I struggle with. But then also in my head, if you have a darker skin tone, then these like crease shades, I don't know how well they would work for you, so I don't know. I struggle with this highlighter shade. I do think that these shadows do work best, especially if you want like more pigment on top of the tacky base. That's why when I did try to do that smoky eye, I went straight in with the purple rather than building up from the crease and working my way down like I do with more pigmented shadows. If you were looking for a super pigmented shadow, like an ABH, a Huda Beauty shadow, something like that, these are not for you. There is a sheerness to these shades that I really enjoy because I think it translates to this effortlessness on the eye, which I believe is kind of on brand for luxury makeup. I think luxury makeup, from what I've seen, it doesn't tend to be very high pigment, exciting, super fancy. It tends to be like a wash of color on the lid, this like natural elegance, I guess. A lot of quads, a lot of small palettes, a lot of like 1 or 2 shadow looks. And so given that thought process, that aesthetic, if you're into that, you would really like this. Now, my mom really likes these palettes, and I think it's because they have that sheer quality. They're forgiving, so she can really load up her brush and doesn't have to worry about a ton of fallout. They're pretty good about not having a bunch of fallout, and it never looks like crazy. And then she's not a huge shimmer person. She doesn't like a ton of metallic like glitter like some people like me. And so she likes just being able to take a little bit of the shimmer shade and just tap it on her lid like super lightly and feel a little bit more glitzy than normal, but nothing crazy. So that's where I kind of have landed on this palette. It is beautiful, but it is not for everyone. If you want full pigment, if you want super beautiful, like rich, buttery metallics, no. Because even though these two I'm not like disappointed with, they're not the most beautiful metallics I've ever swatched, and I'm sure if I tried to dupe these in my collection, I could find something similar. I mean, this almost looks like the rose gold shade in the Soft Glam palette, I believe, just from looking at it now. But yeah, these are, I'm not disappointed in them because they pick up nicely with the brush and because they're a little bit darker. I guess I'm less upset about the sheerness than I am with the light gold shade. I feel like I'm really harping on this light gold shade, and I'm sure there's people out there who are like, it's fine, you're just picky. I think it's just because if I did like it, I would use it every single time I used this palette, because these kinds of shades are super easy to throw in the inner corner or just do really nice looks where you do just a little bit of something in the crease and then that all over the lid. I tend to do that a lot. And so that's part of why I feel like this palette would be so much more useful to me if I liked that shade. But that's a personal preference thing. So those are my main thoughts. I think that this, again, I keep saying like that effortless elegance, and I was really happy with every look that I did with this palette. I think they looked really beautiful. I think that I felt kind of fancy using this. There is an allure. On the one hand, I feel very fancy while using this because it's Dior. On the other hand, I do feel like as far as luxury packaging, this isn't the prettiest. But since all of their palettes have the same outer packaging, I think that they're smart to have the clear lid because you can very easily tell which one's which. So if you're someone like my mom who has, I think 2 of these or 3 of these, she can tell which one it is without having to open it or like look around on the packaging for the name. But like a Path McGrath palette, you have to like open them to see which one it is. I'm pretty sure I've seen people decluttering them and being like, I don't know what this is. So yeah, I think I don't take back any of the thoughts that I had in my first impressions. I do think that these shadows wear really well. I do tend to get a little bit of wear away right in my crease because I have really like pretty hooded eyes, and so that all of the skin folds up and it messes with eyeshadow. But that happens with most shadows on me. I do think that the wear looks good, and sometimes they do fade a bit. Sometimes I do look in the mirror and I'm like, this looked smokier and like more vibrant at the beginning of the day than it does now. But I'd rather have a shadow fade a little bit than like crumble or smear or anything like that. If one of these color stories speaks to you, I would definitely recommend going in store, swatching it next to other shadow formulas that you know you like. And if they're swatching similarly, or if you like things that are a little bit more sheer, then I might recommend considering picking up one of these. But if you are someone who does like really high pigment shadows that are and you find those easier to manipulate, these are beautiful, but they're not for you. So that is everything that I have for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that this was helpful and not just me blabbering constantly. But I did really enjoy taking the time to fully invest myself in this palette for about a month, and I think it's a beautiful part of my collection. I will continue to use it, and I'll probably continue to travel with it because it is kind of ideal for that for me. So that's everything that I have for you. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you are having a fantastic day wherever you are, and that I get to see you in a future video. Thanks, guys!